everyone. Welcome. I'm Ken Woods, Artistic Director of the English Symphony Orchestra, and I'm so pleased to welcome composer Jay Reise on ESO Digital. Jay, it's great to see you.
Wonderful to be here, Ken. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for doing my piece. It's a great pleasure.
Well, obviously, this is a piece I've known for a long time in its earlier guise for violin, cello, and narrator. And for me, when we got thinking about doing an orchestral project at ESO, I guess the thing I wanted to avoid was getting into the realm of paint by numbers children's pieces, which can be quite formulaic.
Hmm.
You know, Prokofiev, for all his genius, kind of created a template that's been much abused over the years.
Oh, I'll say, right. It's
You
hard to
know,
get away from it.
the Warrior Violinist isn't like that at all. It's really a through composed piece of music.
Yes, I wanted to really tell the story through music, and I think that folk tales, fairy tales are very passionate pieces. And Peter and the Wolf is a little bit different because its purpose is different. It's more one of those ironic, jolly kind of pieces with a little story there. But in the case of a lot of these, they're quite passionate pieces. Even Snow White and Cinderella, those are very passionate works. And Prokofiev, to get back to him, who did such the large orchestral versions, the ballet versions of Romeo, the story of Romeo and Juliet, even though Shakespeare has that fairy-like story, that incredible passionate quality, and of course Cinderella. Those are very passionate works, and I thought that the storyline of the Warrior Violinist fit that more than, let's just say Peter and the Wolf or something like that. So I tried to make a passionate piece, a kind of symphonic piece almost, in a sense.
I mean, it was always striking to me that even in its duo version, it felt like an orchestra piece, not in terms of being overwritten, but it had a
Mm-hmm.
huge dynamic range to it,
Mm-hmm.
and a sense of that sort of symphonic grandeur of really taking someone on a big
Mm-hmm.
emotional journey.
Well, as I was thinking about it, I was thinking about our interview today, and I knew that we would talk about the differences of the two, and it occurred to me that in some ways, very in kind of an intuitive way, I felt with the duo version when I was writing it that I was writing a piece that was an orchestra piece for two instruments, for a violin and cello, and in some ways, and this is obviously sort of, it's imagined, but it's almost backwards in a sense that you're usually transcribing larger pieces for smaller forces in this kind of a case. And though I did not have great difficulty writing the duo version, there were things in the orchestra version that were much more obvious.
Mhm.
And the limitations of the orchestral size somehow completely suited the piece. I have another tone poem for orchestra, full orchestra, based on Oscar Wilde, Selfish Giant. And that's a full orchestra piece. It's a big medium piece, and there's no narrator, although I have a narrator version of it. And this piece, the Warrior Violinist, the smaller forces, the solo winds and the solo brass could each speak in a turn. I tried to give everybody a solo, so that they're like individuals commenting on the whole in that. And there was integration that I enjoyed working with in this version of it.
I suppose a project like this is a little bit different than a normal orchestration or arrangement, also because you are inevitably adding to the original as opposed to
Right.
just
Mm-hmm.
distributing the original.
Mm-hmm.
I know when I did my arrangement of the Brahms A major piano quartet, there was nothing to add to that. It's
Right.
just
Right.
assigning everything to everyone else. But when you take something that is just originally for two voices,
Mm-hmm.
how much new musical material is there in the new version? And for a non-musician, how do you generate that new content out of what was already there?
Well, the first thing is, to my mind, I think, is the contrapuntal element, the polyphonic element. The solos, even though I was happy to write them in, they sort of just came up. They just happened. I mean, they're going along, and you need background and something to happen. And especially with the narrator, the narration, the unfolding of the piece, the solos just seem to kind of glide in. I've always thought of the instruments that I write for as characters. Whether it's a string quartet or a duo or the orchestra, that whenever somebody picks up an instrument and begins to play, that instrument is a character commenting and joining in with the rest. So that in this instance, where I had just the two instruments and all of the gestures and the harmony is all the same, things like that, it was a matter of others then participating in the discussion, so to speak.
And in that sense of instruments as characters, one thing that you've kept from the original is the violin as the
Right.
protagonist. And
Right.
now it's almost a violin concerto, isn't it?
Right. That was
There
actually
was
one of the
once a
things.
young fellow who everyone thought was a dreamer and lazy. He hated to do schoolwork and never helped around the house. The only thing he cared about was playing his homemade violin. He would play it all day.
That was actually one of the things I wrestled with a little bit, because it was first obvious to make it a violin concerto, but it's not a violin concerto, and it has, all of the obvious restrictions that a concerto doesn't. So I did try to incorporate sort of reverse of what I did before. The violin is clearly a solo against the other instruments, whereas in the duo version, the violin is obviously the violin of the protagonist, but is also very much the ensemble, because it's half the ensemble. So,
Yeah, there's got a
uh,
lot more sort of worker bee stuff to do in the
right,
duo version, where she can be a bit more of a
right.
prima donna in
Mm-hmm.
in the new version. I was just going to suggest, we talk a little bit about the story itself and how
Mm-hmm.
you chose it, and what listeners can expect from the story.
Well, the story was suggested by David Yang, and of course that was our original project. Since he was the director of Auricolai, or is the director of Auricolai, of which you were a member at the time, and there was the recording of the original version. But David was working on a project for the Philadelphia schools, in which he was commissioning composers to write or present fairy tales and folk tales for two instruments, a narrator, in this case, violin and cello, and David was the narrator. And so I got involved. David and I are old friends. We work at the University of Pennsylvania together. And he asked me to participate in this. And he has a passion, it turns out, for fairy tales and folk tales. He has a great collection of them. And that's why he formed Auricolai, which is a storytelling troupe, really. I think that's rather, it sounds so old. It sounds like 19th century or earlier, right? It actually sounds of the period of some of these stories, right?
Absolutely,
Something
yeah.
of the 20th century. Of course, troop now, we don't troop around town, we troop around the internet and exchange these
A digital
stories
troop,
and ideas and pieces with each other. But David asked me, I presented a number of stories, and we both liked this one a lot. And I guess I sort of gravitate to the romantic fairy tale type of thing, where I can open up expressively, and there's a seriousness to the story that I also liked a lot. Um, it's an unusual story. It's not really a folk tale or I guess more of a fairy tale, because it has a little bit of magic in it. To some extent, there's a certain supernatural element. But it supposedly goes back to ancient Egypt, and there are a number of versions that David found, and I can't find any source that's directly from Egyptian literature, from that's in hieroglyphics translated into English. But we worked with the story that we had. I did add several things that I thought were important. First of all, the ending. The original story ends with the warrior violin. Maybe I shouldn't tell the story.
You can tell a little bit of the story, yeah.
A little bit of the story, right?
Yeah.
Let me just say that the whole ending and the whole musical episode of the ending is entirely different from the ending of the original Egyptian story. And I used the violin in place of a flute. The story originally had a flute in it. The boy had a flute. And I had a little bit of a problem with placing the time in a way, because it's Egyptian. We all think ancient Egyptian. And the original story mentions Tutmos, which is probably Tutmos the Fourth from the 18th dynasty. And the 18th dynasty is where all the crazy things happen with Akhenaten and the religious things going on. In the Sphinx, between the paws of the Sphinx is a story supposedly about Tutmos and his dream at the base of the Sphinx to pay homage, libations, and some say to actually repair the Sphinx, which is still an ongoing project, right? So I was working with the idea of the boy in the dream and placed him by the pyramid. And, Tutmos also had a dream by the pyramid. And it also occurred to me that in this day and age of trying to instill a sense of history and appreciation of literature, that many of the young children either A, know what the Sphinx is, so it's a good point of identification, or B, do not, in which case it's a good point of introduction. So those were a couple of things I used. The violin, I researched this, there was no violin as we know it in ancient Egypt. They had only plucked instruments. So that was, I really like to be as accurate as possible. One reason being, I've learned that working with children, the hands go up and they ask these questions, right? And you sort of have to either be prepared to say why you didn't do something or explain why you did. So as far as I'm concerned, the boy lives sometime in the past in Egypt. And it has to be past the 8th century because that's when bowed instruments started to come into existence, like the aru in China. So for those reasons, I have the violin, and I can say that it's sometime after ancient Egypt, even though I'm not quite sure when the story originated.
It's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Now, I think it's not surprising for those of us who know your music that you would take on a story like this, which is set not in Western Europe or in America, because your music generally, I think, embraces lots of different world musics. I mean, your background is very much in classical music. I know you're a big Mahler aficionado, studied
Yeah,
with
I
George
love
Crumb.
Mahler. One of the things I was aware of when I was a graduate student many years ago was it was very clear that there was, I don't know if it's a limit to what was going on in Western music, but I was very attracted to the idea of opening up my Western musical language into other languages and discovering world music. This is, my generation, I'm just turned 70. Globalization has been the big issue over the last 30 years. I mean, that's what's happened. We've been able to travel all over the world, meet people, encounter cultures. And I had a big boost in this from somebody who lived around the block from me when I lived in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. I moved to the neighborhood, invited people over and ran into people. And this fellow came into my house, and he was noticing my record collection, and he was nothing unusual. He asked if I had a copy of Barrios Circles, and I did. We started talking about that. And then we started talking about rhythm because I had in my mind a quest for rhythm. I thought that there were things that could open up in my style with rhythm, and that Western music was a little bit behind somehow in rhythm. I knew there was rhythm elsewhere, put it that way. And I had assembled many files on many rhythms, African rhythms and things like that, which are all very interesting. But I felt very limited in sort of what I call the paced aspect of our approach to doing this, finding a rhythm, an unusual rhythm, 3 parts, putting a viola, cello, and violin on the 3 parts and simply placing that rhythm into my music. It's sort of like the cut and paste didn't really, I wanted something that generated rhythm. And within meeting this fellow, his name was Adrian Larmond, and meeting him, I'd say within 90 seconds, I knew that he knew more about rhythm than anybody had ever met. Just in the discussion, just in the talking about it. So I studied Carnatic rhythm of South India. I studied it with him for 2 years, 3 years, and then incorporated that very readily into my music. I'm also fond of obviously with modal music and how different cultures play with modes and things like that. So I've done a lot of work like that, but I don't think that anything in my music is particularly reminiscent of these styles are similar. I'm a little bit cautious about overemphasizing, for instance, the Carnatic element, because people go to a concert and they think somebody's going to come out with a sitar and be sitting down and all that. No, 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 it's not like that. It's a little like teaching somebody in India how to write a Bach chorale, and then they adopt it to ragas, and that it's going to be a whole different integrated experience. So that's how that got started. I'd also say, in answer to the question, that I was intrigued the other day to notice that right now the 3 projects I've been working on are The Warrior Violinist with the Egyptian Tale. My opera is, I'm writing an opera right now about Al Capone called Al Capone and Family, which is, it's Italian American. It has Neapolitan elements, clearly American elements, all that kind of thing going on. And I just finished a piece for Kyoshin Arts in New York on Japanese poetry. And I've been to Japan, and I'm very fond of Japan and the culture and that. So you're right. I have a very strong attraction to the music of the world, you might say, and it's very exciting.
Yeah, just maybe for our listeners, think of 1 or 2 spots in the piece where we can direct them to some differences between the original version and the final version.
He played more beautifully and sadly than he ever had before. He played and played, pouring his heart out. His music became more and more intense, and after a time, he became so excited that he thought he would faint. Finally, he could play no longer, and he suddenly jumped down the wall and ran. But as he jumped, he dropped his violin in the garden.
His music became more and more intense, and after a time he became so excited that he thought he would faint. Finally, he could play no longer, and he suddenly jumped down the wall and ran. But as he jumped, he dropped his violin in the garden.
But there's one section that sort of comes into a big C major bass chord, very large and theatrical, which, of course, it's interesting because it's at a high point of the story. So there's a passion in the story going on, and a passion even with the 2 instruments playing, that they are playing very passionately. But of course, it's something that really opens out tremendously with the orchestra. It's probably the climax of the music in some ways, in terms of the expression of the young man's passion for the princess. Some of the solos, for instance, the horn solo and the flute solo are entirely new.
Yeah.
Possibly there's something like that.
One day, he was walking through the city when he found himself standing beside a high wall. He wondered what was on the other side. Slinging his violin over his shoulders, he very carefully began to climb the wall, inching his way up as he placed his fingers and toes in the small cracks between the stones. And when he reached the top, a beautiful garden greeted his astonished eyes. There were enormous palms with
One day, he was walking through the town when he found himself standing beside a high wall. He wondered what was on the other side. Slinging his violin over his shoulders, he very carefully began to climb the wall, inching his way up as he placed his fingers and toes in the small cracks between the stones. And when he reached the top, a beautiful garden greeted his astonished eyes. There were magnificent...
Jay, it's great to talk to you as always. I hope we can do it again in person in Philly or New York before too much longer. It's a long time for all of us to go without actually sitting around in a room and talking about music and sharing music in person. We wish you all the best of luck with Capone. That's going to be very, very exciting. Your website is jreise.com, and listeners can find a lot more of your work there, and I hope they'll be encouraged to explore it. But thank you so much for being a part of this wonderful project.
Thank you so much, Ken, and I look forward to the premiere on Friday.